It's my privilege to introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Safwat Marzouk is a brother in Christ, a husband to Caroline, a father to Calista and Julian, a professor and a writer. He grew up in Egypt. He moved into the United States 15 years ago. So he probably had about 14 snow events, snow experiences, winter experiences. And Dr. Marzouk and his family live in Goshen, Indiana. He enjoys playing and watching football that you guys call soccer, not American football. So it is my privilege, Dr. Marzouk, to present you today to our audience, and may the Holy Spirit be with you. It is your first session, brother.
Thank you so much, Fanusi, and good morning, everyone. It's wonderful being with you. I definitely appreciate the introduction as a sibling in Christ. That's what unites us and brings us all together this morning. I'm grateful to God that we're able to meet despite all of the challenges that we are all facing because of the pandemic, and that we're fully trusting that the Holy Spirit is bringing us together despite the distance, and that we're all in a different space. I'm sure there are many things we miss about being together in real time and real space, but we are also grateful that we're able to actually meet in this way and reflect, worship, be transformed by the presence of God in our midst. I also want to begin with a word of gratitude for the Mennonite Church Canada at large, and also MCEC more specifically, for inspiring me actually to be thinking about these questions about Intercultural Church. The work that have been that I've delved into started with my presentation in MC Canada in Saskatoon about 4 years ago, or now almost 4.5 years ago. Many members of the Mennonite Church Canada have also taught me theology or English when I was a student at the seminary in Cairo. So there are lots of connections and lots of lovely faces that I have seen on the Zoom screen, and also new faces and new friends that I hope we continue to know each other as we serve God together. This worship time has been truly a blessing, hearing the multiple voices and multiple experiences of who God is. And that's one of the key aspects about what it means to be an intercultural church, is that we become enriched as a faith community as we see how culture shapes how people experience God, and how experiencing God transforms culture. And as we come together before God to worship, to serve, to witness, then we have a fuller picture of who God is and who we are becoming as God's people. I will have kind of like two ways of presenting on Intercultural Church. The first session will be more leaning towards some theological reflections with also some definitions that I hope will help us to have a more common ground as we try to understand what we are talking about. The second session, I will try to reflect with you on some practical matters. I'm not a practical theologian per se, but I will do those reflections as a Bible scholar as well. And that's what one of the things that I try to contribute to this conversation is I leave the fun parts of solving problems in practical aspects to pastors and to leaders and to practical theologians. And my contribution is inviting us all to actually rediscover what it means to read the Bible from this posture of an intercultural church, or that we reclaim the biblical text as texts of diaspora, texts of migrants, texts of people who are on the move. So you will, hear a lot about the Bible, even when we are talking about some practical questions that I hope will open up some of those questions for you all. So my presentation is on Intercultural Church, a biblical vision for an age of migration. And again, my training is as a Bible scholar, so I will be delving with you into the biblical aspects of how to think about ecclesiology and what the church is and who we're becoming as well. I want to say something at the outset is that at least in my view, we should not be just thinking about the Intercultural Church just because we found ourselves in a diverse community. Or just because we have recent communities of migrants that now we need to figure out how we become as a church, given the reality. The reality is actually helping us see something that we have not seen for a long time or ignored about what it means to be a church. So, and it's not that I want to create kind of a dichotomy between reality and ecclesiology, or but for some people, sometimes they think, oh, we're talking about Intercultural Church now because we should, because of the survival of the church, or because we should
harder
talk
to
about
run
it
something
because,
with them, they're finally admitting.
We have a reality of migrants around us. We need to figure out how to deal with that. The reality, at least as I see it, is that this kind of context that we are in is helping us discover something that has been true about God's vision for the church all along. And it's because we have been reading the Bible from a perspective of settled communities that we ignore that aspect. And it's the reality that is now helping us see something that we have ignored about the reality of the church all along. So I want to begin with a quotation from Martin Luther King Jr. And I know the words that he is saying are more peculiar to the context of the US, but they also speak truth to the reality of the church in North America at large, including Canada. Maybe in some different ways, the Canadian church had a different experience, but there are still some aspects about what he's saying that I think still ring true, both for the US and for Canada, and whatever the denomination we are talking about. So about 60 years ago, in an interview, Martin Luther King Jr. said that I think it is one of the tragedies of our nation, speaking of the US, one of the shameful tragedies that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is one of the most segregated hours, if not the most segregated hours in Christian America. And we could expand that to think about what does that mean for the church in Canada. I definitely think the church, the Christian church, should be integrated. I'm really intrigued that Martin Luther King Jr. 60 years ago used this word integrated, as opposed to, I'm thinking, segregation, where white people worship alone and people of color or Black people worship alone, or assimilation, where people are welcome as long as they assimilate into the dominant culture of whatever that congregation is. But he uses this word integration, where I see there is more mutuality. There is more willingness to negotiate together what it means to be a church together, rather than this is my church and you are welcome as long as you become like me. So he says that the church should be integrated. And any church that stands against integration and that has a segregated body is standing against the spirit and the teachings of Jesus Christ, and it fails to be a true witness. I'm also intrigued by the word to become a true witness, because to my understanding of what the church is as an intercultural church, the church becomes an embodied witness. We don't just talk about shalom and peace between the nations out there. We don't just talk about justice out there, but we are becoming that body that lives out God's vision of shalom and God's vision of justice to a broken and polarized world. So in some ways, this whole intercultural church has been part of the experience of the church in North America, has been a maybe repressed question, maybe because of privilege, maybe because of oppression, maybe because of injustices, maybe because of the fear of the other, has been kind of relegated, not to be thought about. But we see here in the words of Martin Luther King Jr. that this has been an important question for North America for a long time, and it's not just the result of the recent waves of migration. And if we want to even expand it beyond the white-black kind of dichotomy, even if we think about native nations and Native Americans and First Nations and how Christians, white migrants have related to these communities, which raises lots of important questions about the scope of the questions that we are thinking about. So in my understanding, the question about an intercultural church is also about God's mission in the world, in creating God's body, God's people who are embodying and not just preaching, not just talking about, but actually living into God's mission of bringing people who are different together to become God's people, to witness to a broken and a polarized world. So let's, kind of connect some of the dots of what I've been talking about so far. In my understanding, it is God's vision for God's people to be a people in which boundaries are maintained but also crossed, in which diversity and justice go hand in hand as God forms God's people. And we could make that argument also from the Hebrew Bible, but I will focus on two kind of important events in the life of the church as we see in the New Testament as an invitation to ask ourselves, where are we in relation to God's vision and God's mission in the world, in and through the church, for the world? So we, read in the Hebrew Bible about the Tower of Babel, and also we read about the story of the Pentecost. I will reflect on these two narratives and the relationship in the second half in more details. But if we, at least for now, if you agree with my assumption that we have some sort of a continuity between Babel, where God makes people speak multiple languages, and God gives people through these multiple languages multiplicity of cultures, in some ways creating a multicultural context. There maybe have something been lost, but then there is something happened new where people are not just talking one language, they are speaking multiple languages, and they are speaking through different cultures. But there is still something lost because they were unable to understand each other. So there is kind of like a step forward, but there is, with that step forward, something has been lost. And then in the Pentecost, the birth of the church, we have people from the diaspora who are speaking multiple languages, different languages. They hear the gospel proclaimed in their own language through the gift of translation, which we're experiencing today through the work of Marcel and others who are interpreting and explaining into other languages. We see through the gift of the Spirit a community that is built in which the multiplicity of languages is celebrated, and the diversity of cultures is celebrated and integrated. So between this past memory, the birth of the church in the Pentecost, with the precedent that we see in the Hebrew Bible about God kind of, embracing new people into God's people. So between the memory of the Pentecost and this beautiful image, eschatological vision that we read in Revelation chapters 4 through 7, where diversity is still recognized. Yes, they are all kind of singing the same song, but they are recognized to be people or a community of faith that comes from different people, different tribes, different languages. That is, as we become an intercultural church, difference is not lost. Difference is not erased. Difference is still recognized, but there is still something common that brings us together. So I started my conversation with you saying, this is not about being politically correct. And this is not about the church, the white church is dying, and therefore the hope of the church is in the migrant churches or the churches of people of color. It's not about survival, and it's not just about being politically correct. It's about actually rediscovering God's vision and God's mission that has been in the Bible, witnessed to in the Bible, in the work of Jesus Christ and in the work of the Spirit all along. But we have ignored it or left it behind because we have been reading the Bible and we have accustomed to be a church as a settled church. And what's happening now is that because of the diversity that has become more visible, the voices that are seeking justice and questioning the dominant culture, that we are now discovering what has been there all along. So I'm going to kind of do some definitions now that I hope would help us as we explore this topic together. The first definition that I want to work with is a very complicated definition, which is what is a culture. And when I face a very complicated topic like what is a culture, I lean towards going to the simple definitions and then move from the simple definitions into the more complex kind of question about what is a culture. In the book Many Colors, Sung Chandra simply defines culture as a culture is the way we do things. I would add the way we think and do things, the way we think about things and do them. So if you were to talk about the culture of the church, is the way you think about your identity as a congregation, the way you understand how you're doing your ministry, your worship, your witness, and so on. And yes, this is a overly simplified definition of what a culture is. Because in a more complex way, a culture is a product of, but it also reinforces a shared knowledge. That is, a culture is out there, but it's also constructed. It's also made up by how we talk, how we think, how we relate, how we do things, and so on. So it's not essentialized. It's not like, a culture is something that we could simply put our hands on and say, this is our culture, and we essentialize it and we close a box over it. But at the same time, if we only talk about culture as ever-changing, if we only talk about culture as porous, culture as something that is never finished, which is true about what a culture is, it's dynamic, then we will not be able to have this conversation. So I think I'm calling for some sort of a balance between trying to talk about a culture, the way we do things, the way we think about things in a given place and time by concrete people, not, kind of random stereotype, generalized statements that have nothing to do with the time and space and reality of this particular context that we are part of. But at the same time, if we just talk about always concrete, specific, then we might not be able to kind of have some sort of, I don't want to say stereotype or prejudice, but some sort of a common belt that would help us to kind of negotiate what we are getting into. So a culture is the way we do things. So as we talk about an intercultural church, I want to invite you to be thinking about, how have you been doing worship in your church? How have you thought about your mission and vision as a congregation? whether this is a recent migrant congregation, a congregation that has been working on becoming more diverse, a congregation that has been living into this vision of intercultural church for a while. So think about the assumed things that you have taken for granted in your congregation. Why do you worship this way? Why do you do the preaching this way? Why do you think your mission and vision are this way into your church? How what you have been doing has been reinforcing this culture, and how this culture has been shaping and reinforcing the way you have been doing things in your congregation. So there are, if we were to think of a continuum, we could think about 3 words of monocultural, multicultural, and intercultural churches. And in a monocultural model of a church, the church or the society actively seeks to preserve a particular culture. And it's likely a culture that has been connected to dynamics of power and assumed to be the dominant culture, and other voices of change or difference have been seen as a threat to that dominant culture. And therefore, there has been an attempt to create an enclave around what the church is, or what the culture of the church is, or what this community is all about. Difference and change may be perceived as a threat, and relations with outsiders are minimal or non-existent. And if they happen in a way that may be defensive or protective, because there is an assumed culture that this kind of monocultural body is trying to protect. I want to problematize what I just said, because even if you look at a monocultural context, let's say if you walk into an Egyptian church, even that Egyptian church has, yes, they may all be Egyptians, but within that congregation, there is diversity. But that diversity may have been silenced by some sort of power relations where, because of gender, because of sexual orientation, because of economic status, those kind of diverse voices have been kind of muted in some ways. So yes, there is truth that there is no such a thing as monocultural, because again, culture is something dynamic and is really related to how even the individual live out their culture in relation to the whole community. But at the end of the day, when you walk into a particular context in a particular church, you might still say, yes, there is a diversity, but that diversity possibly have been muted here within that church because there is a dominant culture that has in some way silenced difference and change. In a very good book I recommend to you, also called Intercultural Church, Bridges of Solidarity in the Migration Context, by Agnes Brazel and Emmanuel Guzman. They talk about, moving from this kind of monocultural context into the multicultural church or society, which is closer to the Canadian kind of model of a salad bowl, or living into a multicultural society. Whether that has been successful or not, that's a different question. But in a multicultural church or a multicultural society, difference is celebrated. Whether that difference is ethnic or racial or theological or cultural. In that model, people stand alongside one another. So it's kind of like creating, as you would imagine, some sort of islands. Yes, they are all in the same body of water, but they are still and they are recognizable, they are visible, but the interaction between them is not affecting who this community is becoming or who this church is becoming. So multiculturalism refers to the policy or the relationships, interpersonal or structural relationships of peaceful coexistence of different cultural communities in one nation state or in one congregation or one denomination, with neither intention nor vision of interaction to create a larger community of bonding. So what happens in a multicultural church is, you could, if you want to simplify it, multicultural churches or multicultural society is about coexistence. But it's not so much about interaction or intention for interaction or ability and willingness to work together towards envisioning something new together. It's kind of like, let's kind of learn how to coexist, but in separate ways. Interculturalism, however, according to Agnes and de Guzman, interculturalism not only respects difference, but creates a space for the interaction of diverse cultural groups within a society or within a church. So in an intercultural church, there is intentionality about creating a common space in which people are themselves, but as they walk into this space as who they are willing to be transformed and changed. They are willing to negotiate together something new, to produce something new. And if we want to talk about it in light of the Pentecost and in light of the eschatological vision of Revelation 4-7, they are trying to live into God's mission in the world, proclaimed in Jesus Christ, who is our Prince of Peace, and listening and becoming obedient to the work of the Spirit and the witness of the Spirit to embody something new to the world around them. So in an intercultural church or a society, the members have the commitment. They have the commitment to create the mechanisms to relate to one another. And when they are committed to be in a relationship with one another, they are willing to be transformed by these relationships. So we don't walk into these relationships in order to protect who we are. We walk into these relationships knowing who we are, because our identity matters. But as we walk into these relationships, our culture, our identities, our languages, and what we're bringing is not a finished project. It's not a rigid project. It's not a concrete project that cannot be transformed as we encounter the other. In my book, this is shameless self-promotion, Intercultural Church, a Biblical Vision for the Age of Migration, I want to take the work of this kind of like intercultural church as a place where difference is celebrated and difference is negotiated to create something new, to talk more about also being sensitive to the work of the Spirit among us, because it's not just our work and it's not just our vision. It's God's vision, it's God's work, it's God's mission, and God calls us to become part of that, to live into that by the power of the Spirit. So when you encounter obstacles, which you will, trust me, and I'm sure all of you know that, we do our best, we plan well, we use any tool that would help us to know who we are and to know each other in deep ways. But at the end of the day, we also realize that this is the work of the Spirit within us and through us to form this covenantal community. There is something bigger than just being politically correct, although I'm actually not bothered by being politically correct. I think it's good to be sensitive and to learn how to express ourselves in ways that reflect our commitments of diversity and justice. But what binds us is not just some sort of a social theory, although I am committed to social theory and critical race theory and using them to critique even the church itself. But there is something about the covenantal community, the covenant that God initiated through the work of Jesus Christ and the power of the Spirit to bring us together. And that's what holds us together when we fail, not only when we succeed. It's this covenantal relationship that God initiated, that God invites us to become part of it, that holds us together, especially when we fail, especially when we face challenges, especially when we try to plan worship and we find it so hard to do, especially when we try to talk about God and we realize that we have different theologies, especially when we are trying to kind of do the work of justice and we know that it's challenging and it's hard. It's this covenantal relationship that holds us together. But my definition of an intercultural church, because it is a covenantal relationship and because it's God's vision for us as a church, I want us to hold this tension that I define it as our work as an intercultural church seeks to cultivate the hard work of an agrarian life, to cultivate a decentralizing unity and fosters a just diversity. A decentralizing unity and fosters a just diversity. I want to unpack this in the coming few minutes. A decentralizing unity. I emphasize us being grounded in who we are, in our identity, in our culture, because that is a gift from God. But if we become self-absorbed with who we are, we might start to create these walls around us because we just want to protect who we are. And we might walk into this relationship asking, so what holds us together? And by unity, I don't mean hegemony. I don't mean creating a dominant culture that is associated, let's say, with white power that says, you know, all of these other cultures are welcome as long as they become like us. I'm not talking about this kind of unity. But I want to talk about unity because I don't want us to become fragmented. I want us to find a common ground, and in that common ground, in which we are decentralized, not because what we bring and our identity is a threat, no, but because I don't want us to focus so much on our identity and our culture to the point that we are unable to find what's common ground. But here comes the other side of the tension. Finding what is common, finding what holds us together, should not happen at the expense of diversity. And by diversity, I mean a just diversity. Diversity that actually lifts up the voices in equal ways. Diversity that gives power to all those who are involved in this body of Christ. So it's not just diversity in terms of representation. It's actually diversity that seeks to deconstruct those who have abused their power to marginalize others. And it's kind of diversity that empowers those who have been marginalized for a long time in the life of the church. So an intercultural church is a church that is able to live into this tension of something that holds us together beyond maybe transcending the peculiarities of our identities and cultures, but also as it seeks this transcendent unity, not hegemony, unity, it's actually not oblivious to difference. It celebrates difference. And it celebrates difference in a way that is doing justice, in a way that is empowering those who have been marginalized for a long time, in a way that critiques those who have been abused their power, those who have been at the center for a long time at the expense of the rest of God's people. So in this culture of decentralizing unity and just diversity, this covenantal relationship celebrates difference and sees difference as a gift, not as a threat. And that difference, this identity, when we walk into these relationships, that identity is not rigid, is not a finished project, but is porous and mutually negotiated, whether those boundaries or those identities. So if you want to put it in a different way, in an intercultural church, we claim who we are. I am a Christian Egyptian. This is my culture. This is how I understand these values. This is how I understand who God is. So I claim who I am. But at the same time, as I do that, I am also critical of who I am. I also understand the limitations of my culture. And that happens in ways that I do it too. I do it to myself, and not like, waiting for those who possess power to do it, but I do it myself. So in some ways, I'm holding myself, but also I am critical of who I am. And if we all do that, then we are positioned to actually negotiate these relationships in ways that are mutually equal in many ways, even with power relationships. So we claim who we are, but we are critical of who we are. When we learn how to offer and to receive, I will explore this in more details in a bit. This notion of mutuality, this notion of knowing that you and I and he and she and they, depending on how people understand their identity, have something to offer. And we walk into this relationship not to abuse what we can offer or what the other can offer, but to welcome it and to celebrate it. And not to make ourselves at the center of hospitality, but also to be mutually open to see how God is also meeting our needs through those who are different from us. When we are able to claim who we are, but we are critical of who we are, when we offer and receive in mutual ways, then we embody an alternative to the politics, to the models of assimilation and segregation. Segregation is like, you know what? It's great to see this beautiful diversity, but it's hard work. So let's just forget about it. I worship in my culture. I serve in my church. It's not that I hate these people who are out there, who, worship God in a different culture, in a different language, but it's really hard work. So let's just do that and maybe, occasionally meet so that we kind of get that good taste of this multiplicity and diversity. That's a form of segregation where we give up on this vision. We realize, I love my culture too much to kind of even think about changing it. Learning another language or singing another language is so hard work. I don't want to do it. So I'm not interested in investing that space. And therefore, I am just content. And I don't realize how much I am missing about who God is and what God's vision for the church is, because I am lazy, or I don't want to invest that hard work, or I am so invested in my culture to the point that I don't want to be open to see how God is at work through other people's cultures, through other people's faith, and through other people's singing, through other people's understanding of God's mission in the world. Or assimilation, where it's a form of saying, I love having other people around us in the church, but it's much easier if they just learn our language, if they just learn our culture, if they just learn how we do church. And that's what assimilation is. When the church becomes an intercultural covenantal community, thus moving beyond a dominant culture, a monocultural setting, or a multicultural setting. The church proclaims a message of hope in a world that is polarized and divided. And that's what I meant about that this is God's vision for the life of the church, not just to talk about it, but to live into it. And when we do that, we embody it to the world around us. I have used this story in my presentation about 4 years ago in the Mennonite Church Canada Assembly. And it's a lovely story. I want to kind of, I have about, I think about maybe 5 to 10 minutes in my first 45 minutes. So I want to refresh some of those insights and introduce them to those who have not read the book, my book, or who have not, who were not present in the assembly meeting. This is the story of Peter and Cornelius, and it's a story that invites us to reflect on God's mission and God's vision for the church. It's a beautiful narrative in which God is showing us what it means to have boundaries that are maintained but also crossed. It's a story of a marginalized Jew, a marginalized disciple of Christ, Peter, who is hungry, dreams 3 times of a vision in which God offers him food of creatures that Peter knows, according to the Jewish law, he would not eat and he should not eat. But God tells him to eat, and he says, "No, Lord, I should not profane myself." But God told him, "Do not call these profane if I want you to do it." Meanwhile, happening in a different place in Caesarea, we have Cornelius. He is a Roman centurion. He is a man of power. He represents the empire, who is in some ways pious. And God tells him to send to Peter, and Peter will tell you what to do. He sends to Peter. Peter is baffled by the vision. And Peter agrees to go with the messengers of Cornelius. Both of them are baffled by the vision. Both of them are in some ways different religiously, different in terms of power relations, different in terms of understanding what God is up to in the world. Both of them don't know why God is doing this. So when we look at that story gives us an insight on what God calls us to think about when we're thinking about an intercultural church. And the first thing that pops to mind when we read this story is how this story critiques our understanding of the church as my church, of the church as my culture. And this is an interesting point, and I'm going to problematize this a bit in the second presentation, because I'm not opposed to culture. I don't want you to get me wrong. I actually think and believe that God works always through culture, that we cannot just think about God in the abstract, that God chose in incarnation to be part of our world and its cultures. So I'm not in the business of creating a dichotomy between faith and culture. Yes, there are lots of things to critique about our cultures. And that's why I said, we're critical of who we are. But I also believe that God works through who we are and our cultures. But for that to happen, I need to realize that the church is God's project. It was God who kind of mastered this encounter between Peter, who is a Jew, witnessing to Jesus Christ, and this Roman centurion, who in some ways need to be critiqued because he represents the empire. When Peter preached, it was the gospel that was at the center, and the lordship of Jesus empowers the marginalized Jew, gives the space for the marginalized person, and it critiques the dominant culture. It critiques those who represent the empire. It's not about this kind of power. It's about how Jesus came to proclaim a gospel of liberty to those who are marginalized, to give them dignity, and to those who have abused their power in this kind of myth of supremacy, to critique them, to tell them that they need to repent and to understand that it's God who is at the center. And that God is at the center gives power to those who are marginalized. And this kind of upside down kingdom is what Peter proclaims. But then it's the freedom of the Spirit. The Spirit freely just falls on the Gentiles, to the astonishing of those who are circumcised. That the Spirit works in your congregation, in your church, in your life as a community that is seeking to become an intercultural church is part of what it means to be part of God's project. To let the Spirit move freely and to learn how to kind of deconstruct our assumptions that sometimes function as an obstacle to the work of the Spirit. So that is what I meant by saying a decentralizing unity. A unity that is centered around God, that gives space to those who have been pushed to the side and critiques those who have assumed to be at the center all along. The story of Peter and Cornelius also tells us that if we were to build an intercultural church, we think about the life of the church as a mutual need. It amazes me about this story that God did not simply tell Cornelius what he needed to do. I mean, after all, God knows what the gospel is. The Spirit could have revealed to Cornelius in miraculous ways what the gospel is. But God works through bringing people who are different together. The gospel and the power of the Spirit are experienced afresh and in a new way when people who come before each other and say, I see part of God's work, but I know that you also see God's work in a way that is different from me, and I want to learn from you. When they encounter each other, Peter and Cornelius, both of them say it in a different way. I am here. What's going on? Why am I here? Tell me. And when they say that, they are actually saying, I am vulnerable. I need to see what God is up to in the world as I encounter you, although encountering you was something I could never have conceived of. And this is not just about the story of Peter and Cornelius. This happens in the story of Ruth. This happens when she encounters Boaz. This happens also in the story of Joseph and Pharaoh. Like, it's all over the Bible where people who are different, and sometimes different in power, they find meaning in offering, and they find agency in offering when they are marginalized, and they find criticism of who they have assumed to be when they realize that they are also in need of those who are different from them. When we walk into this relationship with this mutual need, we encounter a risk of vulnerability. Vulnerability when we offer because we don't know how other people are going to respond to us. And vulnerability when we receive because we are expressing our weaknesses to others and realizing that we have to rely on the others to show us how God is at work in the world. The story of Peter and Cornelius also tells us that when we encounter each other, when we envision an intercultural church, and the difference between a monocultural church, a multicultural church, and an intercultural church is that we are willing not only to celebrate difference, but we are going to be changed as we encounter that difference. We are humble enough to be obedient to the power of the Holy Spirit, to be transformed when I encounter how my brother or sister around me in this congregation encounter God and encounter the work of the Spirit. It's interesting that in this story, Peter, yes, he's a marginalized Jew when it comes to power, but he is in some ways the insider because he knows the gospel of Jesus Christ. Peter needed the vision 3 times. Cornelius needed the vision 1 time. Sometimes when we think we are the insiders, we become more resistant to the work of the Spirit. And those who are deemed outsiders are more responsive to the work of the Spirit. So it's really interesting to see that the transformation is not just about Cornelius, and it's not just about Peter, but it is mutual. Peter needed to see that, this whole thing about food was not just about eating. It was also about encountering someone who is different. And Cornelius realized that he needed to kind of give away his power as a representative of the empire to express his need for this marginalized Jew to proclaim the gospel to him. When we envision creating an intercultural church, we need practices that helps us to encounter the other. And one of the practices that I will reflect on more in the second half is food, eating together. From the Lord's Supper to other meals that we eat together, to cooking together, to knowing the stories behind the recipes that we cook together, to creating spaces to listen to the stories of, yes, my ancestors have abused their power against these communities, and I repent because I am ashamed or guilty. And others who feel like we have been marginalized and oppressed, and we have been traumatized by civil war, and as we kind of do this fellowship, I want to share my story with you because I am longing for healing. So those practices and those intercultural churches are not just about the tip of the iceberg of what's up there of, we sing in different languages and we greet each other in different languages and extend the peace of Christ in different languages. Although all of these are wonderful ways and concrete ways of actually living into this reality, but it's also about digging deeper into understanding our narratives, our stories. And if that means we change how we do church on Sunday, so be it. If that means that we envision different activities in Sunday morning or Wednesday evening, so be it. So that we actually get to know each other on deeper levels, eating together and sharing stories. The last thing in the story of Peter and Cornelius, which ties a little bit with I said earlier, about, it's kind of like this intercultural church is about like a dance between holding who we are. Through our culture, we are a blessing to others. Through our identities, whatever those layers of identities are, we are God's beloved and God's children, and God blessed us with this culture, blessed us with this identity. But we are also walking into this relationship to be transformed, because culture and identity is not a finished project. because we mutually negotiate what it means to be God's people together. The interesting thing is that when we do that, and to be fully an intercultural church, it's not about loss of who we are. Because even when they have this shared identity of the Spirit being poured on the Gentiles, they were still recognized as Gentiles. And the circumcised were still recognized as circumcised. So our culture, our ethnicities, our languages, our understanding of who God is, our understanding of what respect is, our understanding of what time is, our understanding of how we solve conflict, our culture, our grandparents, our ancestors, our traditions, all of this is not lost. It's celebrated. It's enjoyed by others. It becomes, instead of a closed self-celebration of who I am, it becomes a table that invites others to participate in it. But again, because we're not walking into this on kind of like Jubilee year zero, so therefore, everything is happy and dandy. We are walking into this with the complexities of colonialism, of sexism, of homophobia, of fear of the other, of oppression, of histories of shame and guilt and pain and suffering. So therefore, as we celebrate who we are, as we enjoy this diversity, and as we become a table for the other to enjoy, we are also aware of those power dynamics. And therefore, we need this kind of equality and equity and justice and empowerment as we negotiate those boundaries. I will stop here to honor our time. I think I went maybe about 5 minutes over my time, or a few minutes. So thank you for attentiveness. And in the second half, I will explore with you some kind of practical, but also kind of biblical aspects about this kind of work that we are talking about. Thank you for your attentiveness.
Thank you, Safwat, for your words in this first session. I took lengthy notes, and there are also several really good questions in the chat bar. I want to recognize that we have been sitting, or most of us have been sitting. I see some are standing, but we've been on the Zoom call now for about an hour and 45 minutes. So I'd like you to take a 5-minute stretch break. Do what you need to do. This is your biological break. So take the time you need, and let's try to be back here as close as we can to 10:45. And we'll start with a couple of questions and then dive right into Safwat's second presentation.
Allows us to slowly and in healthy ways start to learn about ourselves as we encounter others, because that's always a learning curve. And it depends on how much exposure we've had as individuals, how much exposure we've had as a community or as a congregation as we encounter that. And there is always risk in doing that. And there is always self-awareness that needs to be at play, because I need to be aware of my privileges or my stories of pain and suffering or exclusion, because those affect how much I'm responsive or how much I am actually imposing myself. Because I could be kind of like imposing myself even though I'm trying to do something good. I'm trying to be hospitable, but as I'm doing it, I'm actually not listening to my own location and the location of the others. So building those bridges is a great start, but I don't think I want to stop there. I want us to kind of push those islands closer to each other, to a point where we don't maybe need the bridge, but we actually live together on the same island. Mm-hmm. And on that island, we start to envision something new, share the resources of both islands, and start to kind of create something new where if someone is having an eye, a bird eye, would be like, wow, look at this beautiful kind of new island that is being created by actually bringing all of these different plants and different cultures and different creatures that are interacting and kind of like creating something new together. with doing that, again, it's kind of like living into attention, and this is what the interculture bit is all about, is a living between attention of, I have something to offer. This is how I understand myself. But as I do that, I'm also, there is not right word for it, but because, creating the space allows, I own the space. Empowering means I have the power. And this is where sometimes I feel like sometimes we get caught onto the language, and I know language expresses reality. I'm not giving up on the importance of language. But in this work, there is always messy spaces. There's always stepping on people's toes. And sometimes my fear of us being too afraid, we're unable to take risk. We're too afraid to actually relate to each other because I'm afraid to say the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. And instead of walking into this relationship with humility and curiosity, help me, this is how I think about it. Help me see how you see it. And when we have this kind of curiosity, then we are starting to actually tap into this language of equal power, this language of let's re-envision leadership into this new island that we are envisioning. Okay. So it's not just about building bridges. I'm hoping that the islands will get closer, and you're holding on to something about who you are, something dear to you that you want to share with others. But you're embracing and learning and being enriched by the other embracing themselves, and so on.
Good. Thank you for that. I appreciate that, Safwat. I want to just briefly highlight that the MCEC Learning Commons is a space where all of these resources will be available. We've put that in the chat a couple of times, but just in case you've missed that, the Pastors Congregation and Chaplains, Pastors, Chaplains, Congregational Leaders event is a Learning Commons event, and we invite you to visit the website. I'll drop the link of the website into the chat box shortly, and there will be more intercultural related resources being generated there over the next while. So note that or highlight that in your search engine, and you can keep coming back to check on that. Want to recognize that we're just running a little bit behind time. That's okay, but we will leave a longer question answer time for the end of Safwat's second presentation. So I invite Safwat to enter into this second session again. Thank you.